Dear God, it is barely July and I've already gotten in over 300 real money fantasy football drafts. And usually in these drafts, because I am taking such a risk of putting this amount of money in fantasy football this year, I try to keep a diversified portfolio. If there's a player that ever falls, say 12 picks past their ADP, almost regardless of my thoughts on that player, I have to say, well, who knows? Maybe they're the Cooper Kupp from last year. Maybe I'm missing something. Let's take him at least in a few of these drafts. But there are 4 wide receivers that I almost have not drafted at all, specifically in the early rounds. I'm going to be happy to go through these guys, tell you why I am personally avoiding them. But before we get into it, please make sure you go down there, drop a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if somehow you play fantasy football and you have not subscribed already. But let's go into our first wide receiver that I'm just going to lead it out there because everybody knows who we are going to say. Everybody is expecting us to talk about Cortez Sutton here. And I want to do something a little bit different in this video because I know everybody watching this has probably already heard my opinion of Cortez Sutton, has already probably heard the negatives that I've dug very deep into. We'll still talk about those, but I want to be fair to Cortez Sutton. I want to come out and talk about the positives and why people are so excited about him. Cortez Sutton right now is going at the very end of round 3 in fantasy football drafts. He's going before front running backs like Travis Etienne, Ezekiel Elliott. He's going before wide receivers like Jalen Waddle, who posted a low-end wide receiver 1 season on a points per game basis as a rookie. He's going before DJ Moore. He's going before the wide receiver 7 last year in Deontay Johnson. You could tell the excitement that people have around Sutton. So let me at least be fair and let me at least talk about some positives and why someone would want to draft Cortez Sutton this year. And then we'll get into why I'm not. With Cortez Sutton, this is a wide receiver that you may want to make the argument, hell, his playing style just didn't match up with Teddy Bridgewater. We know Teddy Bridgewater is not a quarterback that is going to be an accurate deep ball passer. Teddy Bridgewater is going to be someone that favors the options closer to the line of scrimmage. So inherently, those deep threat wide receivers, someone that has on average a higher ADOT, a higher overall air yards per target than you're going to find compared to the other options in this offense, that wide receiver may be disproportionately hurt by the lack of quality quarterback play. And now you're getting Russell Wilson coming over. And if there's something we know about Russell Wilson, it's he is a very efficient passer, particularly a deep ball passer. Not only did you have DK Metcalf succeeding with a higher average at the target compared to an average NFL wide receiver, but at the same time, you had that exact same thing from Tyler Lockett. So the majority of the fantasy football community is coming out here and they're putting 2 and 2 together. They're looking at the air yards that Cortez Sutton had last year where he averaged 96 air yards a game. He averaged 100 air yards a game back in 2019 as well. And people are making the assumption that he is going to be a more natural fit with Russell Wilson than the other wide receivers in this offense. On top of this, there have been positive reports coming out of camp saying, hell, Cortez Sutton is the favorite target for Russell Wilson early on in training camp. So these are positive signs for Sutton, which is inflating his ADP to a point where I simply never even think about the man. Now, if I go through and look at some of the negatives with this Cortez Sutton profile, I don't necessarily want to say, oh, Cortez Sutton was the wide receiver 61 on a points per game basis last year. That means he's garbage. I don't want to say, oh, well, in games where Cortez Sutton's played with Jerry Jeudy throughout his career, he's only averaged 4.5 points per game. That means he's garbage. No, of course. It's a horrible situation in Denver. They had some of the worst quarterback play in the entire NFL. So if you're just looking at the raw points per game from Sutton, if you're just looking at the raw counting stats, you're probably doing yourself a disservice. What I would rather do is I would rather compare him to other wide receivers that were in that same exact offense with that same exact context of quarterback play, of their offensive line play, and everything in between. And so if we are looking at the comparisons that you're going to have for Cortez Sutton versus Jerry Jeudy, for Cortez Sutton versus Tim Patrick, where should we start? Because we know that Cortez Sutton, he played an entire season. Jerry Jeudy missed half the year. Should we start at their counting stats? Should we give Cortez Sutton a bump up just because he played all 17? Probably not. What we should probably do is we should probably start adjusting these games to either a per game way to look at things, or maybe by a route run. Like if we go ahead and you look at last year in this offense and we look at the wide receivers with their yards per route run, you had Jerry Jeudy standing out from the pack. Jerry Jeudy, the second-year wide receiver. Jerry Jeudy, the wide receiver that's younger than Kenny Pickett. Jerry Jeudy, that's almost 4 years younger than Cortland Sutton. He averaged 1.9 yards per route run. And if we cross-reference this with those outside options in Cortland Sutton and Tim Patrick, both wide receivers had only 1.5 yards per route run. So you're telling me that the option that's almost 4 years younger was significantly more efficient in the same overall offensive context? Hell, that's probably the guy that we want. And if we dive a little bit further into this and we go back to those splits that we have referenced almost every single day, almost every single live stream since the offseason started. I know people are so tired of hearing us talk about this. I'm finally seeing some other people look at this and some other people finally talk about this. But there have been 11 games played by both Jerry Jeudy and Cortland Sutton in this same offense over the past 2 years. And in those 11 games played, you have Cortland Sutton averaging 2 receptions a game. You have Cortland Sutton averaging 23 receiving yards a game. You have Sutton averaging 4.5 fantasy points per game. If you cross-reference this with what you had from Jerry Jeudy almost doubles Cortland Sutton in every important statistical category. He doubles Cortland Sutton with his receiving yards per game. He almost doubles Cortland Sutton with his receptions per game. He almost doubles Cortland Sutton with his points per game. Now, I am not coming out here and telling you Jerry Jeudy is going to continue to dominate Sutton the way he has. I'm not going to come out here and tell you Jerry Jeudy is still going to average twice the points per game than Cortland Sutton in games where they're both healthy together. Of course, you cannot project that, especially with the upgraded quarterback coming in, potentially being a more natural fit with Cortland Sutton compared to what we've had over the past 2 years in Denver. But for us to go ahead and to project Cortland Sutton, whose best season ever, he was a high-end wide receiver 3 on a points per game basis back in 2019. That was his best season ever, a high-end wide receiver 3 on a points per game basis. Yeah, he played the entire season, so his counting stats look pretty, but look at points per game. If we are going to all of a sudden project that wide receiver in his age 27 season to be a low-end wide receiver 1 in fantasy, which is almost where he's being drafted. Like I said, he's being drafted before Jalen Waddle, before DJ Moore, before Deontay Johnson, before Travis Etienne, before Ezekiel Elliott. I would say almost all the upside that Cortland Sutton has is baked into that price point where you're almost drafting him at his ceiling. Everything about Sutton at that price is a projection. We've never seen that level of production before, and the man's about to turn 27. So personally, I'm not drafting Sutton, but real quick now, if you think I'm stupid for not drafting Cortland Sutton, make sure you go sign up to Underdog Fantasy, where Cortland Sutton there is going at the end of the 3rd round, where you are more than welcome to go ahead and draft him. I'm streaming on Underdog Fantasy on this YouTube channel every single night, constantly in drafts there, because it's the most fun thing you could ever do. And when you go sign up to draft on Underdog Fantasy and use promo code FLOCK, they will match your first deposit dollar for dollar up to $100. You'll get my 2022 rankings, my Dynasty rankings, my Dynasty rookie rankings. You will support this channel on top of it. And most importantly, you can have some fun, get into drafts with us, get in on the live stream, and just go crush some people in some public drafts. Let's move over to Michael Pittman Jr. This is another wide receiver that, if anything, is going a little bit higher in fantasy football drafts right now. Michael Pittman Jr. is another wide receiver that benefits from playing an entire season. So if we go out of our way and if you pull up Michael Pittman Jr.'s counting stats, oh dear God, the man in year 2 went over 1,000 receiving yards. Michael Pittman Jr. in year 2 looked like a monster on that season total. But he played 17 games. If we dive a little bit deeper in and we convert this to per game numbers, Michael Pittman Jr. was a wide receiver 3 last year. He was the wide receiver 27, 28 on a per game basis, depending on what site you're looking at. Michael Pittman Jr. averaged about 63 receiving yards a game. Now, there are some positives on this Michael Pittman Jr. profile. Like I said, I want to lead off with the positives and why people are so excited about this player. With Michael Pittman Jr., this is a wide receiver that was much more efficient than the other options in his offense this past season. Michael Pittman Jr., unlike Cortez Sutton, was the #1 receiver in his offense in yards per route run. Michael Pittman Jr. averaged 2.1 yards per route run compared to Ashton Dulin at 1.7, compared to T.Y. Hilton at 1.6, compared to Zach Pascal, probably the worst starting wide receiver in the NFL last year, at 0.9. That's dominance you were seeing from Michael Pittman Jr. in Indianapolis. And with Michael Pittman Jr., not only did he dominate with efficiency, but he also commanded a ton of volume in this offense. While yes, he only had about 7.5 targets a game, that was due to the overall offensive context that he was in. He was playing in a rush-first offense with Jonathan Taylor. Not sure if you've heard of Jonathan Taylor before, but he's a pretty good running back. And with us accounting for how many pass attempts this offense had a game, you had Michael Pittman Jr. almost accounting for 25% of his team's target share. That's awesome. If you're looking at that from a year 2 wide receiver, there are reasons to get excited, and I will be the first person to admit I understand the Michael Pittman Jr. hype a lot more than I do with Sutton. Like, I can easily see how someone would want to bump up Michael Pittman Jr. to the point where they are, but I'm looking at it saying, hell, he's being drafted before Kyle Pitts. He's being drafted before James Conner. He's in some of these drafts being drafted before Alvin Kamara, before Josh Allen. Like, dear God, I can't get there, but I understand the excitement that people have. And my hesitation with Michael Pittman Jr. is very similar to Cortez Sutton. I think he's almost being drafted at his ceiling at this price point. I think the projection for this offense to improve may be a little bit too aggressive by most people. Because if we go ahead and look at Matt Ryan coming into this offense, which is the #1 reason why people are so excited, I will agree with you. Yes, 100%. Prime Matt Ryan is in a completely different league than prime Carson Wentz. If you're sitting here 10 years from now and you're just talking about careers overall, we can sit here and say, oh yeah, no, Matt Ryan, he was a fantastic quarterback. Is going to be someone that's in the Hall of Fame, a Hall of Fame level quarterback. But very similar to what we were talking about 39-year-old Ben Roethlisberger last year with a complete drop-off in efficiency, you're seeing almost a very similar thing from Matt Ryan in his age 37 season. If we go back to last year, Carson Wentz posted 7.3 adjusted yards per pass attempt. That was 13th in the NFL. Matt Ryan was sitting at 6.8. That was 19th in the NFL. Now, no. I'm not saying that Carson Wentz was a better quarterback than Matt Ryan last season just because he was higher in adjusted yards per pass attempt. You had Carson Wentz with a better offensive line, an offense that was built around the run, so inherently, he's going to be a more efficient passer overall. I don't want to come out here and say that Carson Wentz is a much better passer now that Matt Ryan's 37 years old. But what I do want to at least put into context is let you know that Wentz was more efficient than Matt Ryan last year, and that Carson Wentz led this offense to be a top 10 offense in overall points scored. Yes, we all remember the playoff game. Yes, we all know that the majority of this success was based on the rushing attack, was based on Jonathan Taylor, was based on this overall coaching scheme, and that's not going to change this upcoming season. So what I'm looking at is I'm looking at an offense that was already top 10, that was centered around the run, and now you bring in Matt Ryan, who maybe, in this much better offensive environment, will be slightly more efficient than Carson Wentz was last year. But we're projecting it. Carson Wentz already had this team top 10 in the NFL in points scored. Do you think Matt Ryan gets them to top 5? So if you pull up my ranking of Michael Pittman Jr. right now, yeah, I have him ranked as a mid wide receiver 2. I have him ranked as a low end wide receiver 2. I am expecting him to take a step forward from where he was at last year. But to expect this mega step forward, for him to be a wide receiver 1 at this point, for you to draft him over Kyle Pitts, who just put up a better season at the tight end position, for you to draft him over James Conner, who could potentially be a top 5 running back this year, that's where I think the hype's gone too far. That's why I am personally not going to be touching Michael Pittman Jr. And now let's go over to another wide receiver going at the beginning of round 3. We're just sliding up fantasy drafts right now. And maybe there's a trend across all these wide receivers. We'll get to that at the end of the video. Mike Williams. With Mike Williams here, yes, 100%. He took a massive step up this past season. With Mike Williams, you were looking at someone that started off so hot that through the first 5 weeks of the season, you had Mike Williams as the wide receiver 2 overall, only behind Cooper Kupp. Mike Williams was averaging 23.2 points per game. Cooper Kupp was at 23.8. Tyreek Hill, 23. Devontae Adams, 22. Like, that is the caliber of a receiver that Mike Williams was through the first month of the season. Now, no, I don't want to come out here and base my argument just off of inefficient play on a week-to-week basis. I don't care about that. If you're going to get me 250 points at the end of the year, I don't care if that all came in the first half, all came in the second half, was split each and every week, as long as those points hit my lineup at some time. Now, what I would say is, you cannot ignore the fall off that we had in the second half, because with Mike Williams, after week 5, this is a receiver that fell down to being the wide receiver 36 on a per game basis during that stretch. Now, yes, of course, he is still going to have that production at the end of the year based on that first 5-week stretch. He was still going to be the wide receiver 15 overall on a points per game basis in 2021. That's fantastic. And if you look at his 2 previous years, in 2020, where he was the wide receiver 66, in 2019, where he was the wide receiver 49, you love to see that breakout. And I will also give a shout out to some other positives on his profile. We can safely say that this is the best coaching staff Mike Williams has ever played with, the best quarterback Mike Williams has ever played with. And Mike Williams, over the past 3 years, has averaged 100 air yards a game over the past 3 years. That's fantastic. So it would make a ton of sense that once you finally get that elite level quarterback in here with Justin Herbert, the number one player to actually benefit is not going to be Keenan Allen. Keenan Allen's going to succeed regardless because he operates close to the line of scrimmage and he can succeed in that range with a washed up Phillip Rivers. But with Mike Williams, you do need that deep ball specialist. You need to make sure that Justin Herbert has that arm strength. So it makes sense. The stars aligned for Mike Williams to have that breakout this past year. But I am always one to look at the macro sample. I'm always one to say, well, at the end of the day, over the past 3 seasons, Mike Williams has averaged the wide receiver 43 finish on a points per game basis. Now, am I going to go out of our way and rank Mike Williams as a wide receiver 4 for this upcoming year? No, of course. I may be an idiot, but I'm not that stupid. Okay, I'm going to say, hell, this is probably the new norm in Los Angeles. Instead of having Keenan Allen, the wide receiver 1, and then a massive drop off down to Mike Williams, I'm going to say, no, this is probably a wide receiver 1A, wide receiver 1B type situation. My issue is going to be the opportunity cost that it takes to have Mike Williams, because this outlier season that he had last year compared to his career averages, not only does it have to repeat, but it has to improve. Mike Williams is currently being drafted as the wide receiver 13 on Underdog Fantasy. He's being drafted 1 pick behind Keenan Allen. And in a lot of these drafts, he's going before Keenan Allen. Mike Williams is being drafted before Josh Allen, before Alvin Kamara, before Kyle Pitts, before James Conner. So I ask you, what has to happen for Mike Williams, the wide receiver that was drafted in 2017? You know what other wide receivers were drafted in 2017? Cooper Kupp. That's how far down the line we are with Mike Williams. It's not like it makes a ton of sense for this wide receiver to just now have that breakout where he is going to be a wide receiver 1 year in and year out when he's going into his age 28 season this year. This wasn't like a year 2, year 3 jump that made a lot of sense. And we can say, yeah, the priors that we had on Mike Williams just don't matter at all anymore. This is who he is now. You're betting on an outlier season to get better. I'm completely fine ranking Mike Williams as a mid wide receiver 2 in fantasy, but to rank him as that low end wide receiver 1, I just can't get behind it. And now our last wide receiver almost didn't classify as an early round guy because I thought that he was going to be going in round 5, possibly round 6. But no, he slid into the top 4 rounds. Now let's go over to Allen Robinson, who's currently being drafted before DK Metcalf, George Kittle, David Montgomery, Lamar Jackson, J.K. Dobbins. With Allen Robinson here, This is a wide receiver that I have to admit, yes, I was an idiot. I came out and told people to draft Allen Robinson last season. I was looking at a wide receiver that you were getting as a mid wide receiver 2 in your drafts that had back-to-back finishes as a wide receiver 1 in fantasy. That was someone that we could safely pencil in for a 25% team target share. While yes, in a bad offense, we are just chasing that volume, and it was idiotic for me to do that. And let me talk about some of the positives you have for Allen Robinson now. This is a wide receiver that will be playing with, by far and away, the best quarterback he's ever had. This is a wide receiver that's played 46 games with Blake Bortles, 36 games with Mitchell Trubisky, 10 games with Justin Fields, 8 games with Nick Foles, 6 games with Andy Dalton, 3 games with Chase Daniel, and 3 games with Chad Henne. He is now going to Matthew Stafford. He is now going to an offense where he will, for the first time in his NFL career, project to be the wide receiver 2 going into the season. Now, what I will also say is Allen Robinson last year was the wide receiver 2 in his offense. Allen Robinson last year averaged 1.2 yards per route run. I don't know if y'all know how bad this is. I've never seen a wide receiver post a season this bad and then bounce back to be a top 24 option. I've never seen it happen. If we go ahead and look at wide receivers that averaged more fantasy points per game last year than Allen Robinson, you had T.Y. Hilton, Braxton Berrios, Khalif Raymond, Danny Amendola. If you look at Darnell Mooney in the same exact offensive context, because I'll be the first person to admit, yeah, it was horrible. You dealt with Justin Fields. You all know I don't like Justin Fields. I've never liked Justin Fields. You had Matt Nagy. Horrible situation for Allen Robinson last year. Darnell Mooney in his second season, who I don't see anybody coming out and arguing that Darnell Mooney's a top 10 wide receiver in the NFL. He overcame this situation, and he averaged 1.8 yards per route run compared to Allen Robinson at 1.2. So for us to go ahead and draft him as the wide receiver 22, when he's going back-to-back with Patrick Mahomes, I've seen Patrick Mahomes slide behind him in a ton of these drafts at this point. Right back to what we were talking about previously. You are projecting so much improvement, especially knowing that Cooper Kupp is a lock for over 25% of this team's target share. You are projecting so much improvement that for him to hit this ADP, everything has to go right. And I don't even know if he has a ceiling that's going to be higher than this, given Cooper Kupp's ability to just demand targets, given the fact that you're looking at a wide receiver that last year was one of the worst starting options in the NFL. Now, thank you, of course, for being a part of the flock supporting the channel. If you have not done so already, go down there, drop a like on this video, subscribe. And I know a lot of y'all are probably going to hate me for this one, so go down to the comment section. Tell me how stupid I am. I get it. I understand. But thank you again. I really do appreciate you. I really hope you have a great day and hope we get to see you with the video tomorrow.